Okay, all right. Thanks everyone for joining today's call. Um, so CARC is Campus Research Consortium. Uh, is an organization for research computing and data professionals who are interested in different aspects of research computing and data. So CARC has different tracks and different working groups and different interest groups that would suit your needs. Um, Sorry, I don't see the screen share for some reason. Anyway, uh, I assume it's working. So
would it be easier if I just went ahead and did a meet? Sounds
yeah,
like
if you please do.
causing me some grief this morning.
Something's yeah.
Yeah, sorry
Something's
for
weird.
technical challenges this morning. As Amit said, CARC is an organization of research computing and data professionals. It's one of the biggest areas of activity is the People Network, which is a sort of year-round virtual conference that includes a number of different tracks, as you see here, data facing, emerging centers, researcher facing, systems facing, and then us here, strategy and policy facing. We also, among our facings, have software facing. We defer to the US RSE, who does all kinds of great stuff around that. Oh, no, it's changed my focus. There we go. We encourage you to get involved. There's mailing lists. There's a bunch of different working groups where people are actively working on different projects and things. There's links. You can, if you follow the GDoc link that's in the chat where we ask you to sign up, you can also get access to the slides. And so these links are all live in there. We really want to thank our steering committee members who help us put together all of these programs and come up with ideas for the tracks. And they're all up here. If you're interested in contributing to the track and have some ideas for things you'd like us to cover, you can either just email us or you can actually join the steering committee. We'd welcome others' participation there. Next month, we're going to be doing our annual recap of a number of fall meetings, including this year, the CARC retreat is co-located with the fall CASC meeting, which is the Coalition for Academic Scientific Computing. Is it academic or advanced? I never remember.
Academic
it is, okay, as well as the big EDUCAUSE conference. And so basically, people who get a chance to go to those come and share some of their impressions and cool things they heard. It's a great opportunity to catch up since we can't all get to all of the different meetings. Today, we're talking about research computing and data cybersecurity requirements, trends, and then we'll also hear about use cases from a couple of different institutions. And we've got some great speakers here. We're going to talk about sort of what they're seeing across the landscape, and then what's happened at individual institutions and what their experience has been. And then we encourage everybody to join the discussion and share what we're learning and what we're seeing across our community. And so with that, I will turn it over to Erik Deumens from the University of Florida, and he will take over his presentation. Thanks.
Yes. So, and I'm from the University of Florida, but I'm also part of the regulated research community of practice, together with Carolyn Ellis, who is the PI of the NSF grant that created the regulated research community of practice. And so we will talk about how the world is changing and how an organization like CARC and any other organization that is involved in supporting research computing will have to sort of adjust and deal with these things. So first, I will talk about briefly changes in doing research, specifically the issues of integrity and cybersecurity all of a sudden are much more prominent than they have ever been. And then the second aspect is research infrastructure. What is the cyber infrastructure that you need to meet these new requirements that are coming from the outside? And that will have to talk about compliance programs, because that's what all the agencies are asking for. And then how do you manage shared knowledge, which is the goal of research, and shared infrastructure, which is what you need in order to actually do the work, because they're all getting more complicated and more expensive, and you cannot just all do it on your own. So what is happening? Over the last decade, in an accelerated way, the world has been opened up to all kinds of attacks that didn't exist before, where people are stealing data, stealing research ideas, and the federal government and state governments and also individual companies that you might work with at your academic institution are now much more aware of, hey, we're not going to just share our important, valuable data to infrastructure on other organizations unless they show some kind of due diligence. And that is even the case when you're talking about fundamental research, because everybody sort of has this notion, well, my research is fundamental, so in the end, it's all going to be open. I'm going to publish it. I'm trying to share. I want more collaborators. But there is an issue even there that requires a little bit more carefulness. So what is happening? The forces driving these changes are the fact that now everybody is using computers, and these computers are all connected on the internet. If they're not connected to the internet, you're very much hampered in trying to do your research. That's how you don't go to the library anymore. You can just get it from the internet. And so it's important to note that the value proposition that you're trying to get results in the end to share, but there is a problem now that if you're working on your thesis for some number of years and you have this great idea, you want to have that data and your ideas, your draft ideas, you want them to be only shared with the people that you really trust and that are collaborating with you. You don't want it to be open, and you certainly don't want some other person steal these ideas and then publish them and claim to be the first with your idea, because that will seriously jeopardize your career prospects. I mean, there's a big difference between having a great idea and being somebody else who is in the world is now recognized as, yeah, he came up with that idea too, but somebody else already published it first. And then it's, of course, even worse when that other person didn't actually come up with the idea, but stole it from you. So that is something that now is much more on people's radar, and governments and funding agencies and contracting partners are asking you explicitly to show that you are taking care of these things. So I'm going to give here a very brief chart of how this has accelerated. So in 2003, 2014, we had the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, where people started to say, hey, for the federal government, we need to be more careful and more diligent about our data. Then in 2010, there was an executive order that was trying to say, hey, we're going to classify data. And now everybody, even outside the federal government, needs to heed some extra precautions managing that data. And then the federal government started to build a program to make that a contractual requirement when you have any contract, and that is coded in the Federal Acquisition Rules set, which is a big thing that every university administrator knows about. And then in 2015, University of Florida actually was forced to build a system. So that's where we got dumped into this at the high level, and we needed to learn about what is a compliance framework. Then in 2017, the federal acquisition rule got modified. There is the defense, the Department of Defense has an extra set of rules that are built on the general that apply to all contracts. The Department of Defense have these special ones, and they required that you would follow NIST 800-171, which is a document developed by NIST, and it specifies 110 controls that you have to take care of and be compliant with when you're managing data that is classified as CUI, which is controlled unclassified information. And in the contract, the Department of Defense, when they reach out to you, when they give you a grant and they sign a contract with your institution, they will specify this data is CUI. You have to manage it according to these standards. And then in 22, there is a National Security Presidential Memo 33 that calls for protection of research data. And this comes back to even fundamental research is touched upon. When you were sort of looking at the DFARS in 2017, it's like, well, you know, you're dealing with the Department of Defense. They deal with special data. That's fine. And if you don't want to deal with that, then you don't have to deal with it. If you do deal with their data, then they have the right to sort of ask you to be more careful with it. But now it's going to be much more pervasive with that NSPM memo, where everybody has to worry about the data. And the reason is that even fundamental research, when it is the goal to publish it eventually, you don't want it to be, you want it to be published with the right authors and the right stake in place. And if you want to apply for a patent, you don't want somebody else to apply for a patent that's based on ideas that you are the inventor of. And then in 2024, the federal rules for student aid also had a change that caused a lot of security, and that can show you how impactful to the operation of a university these new regulations can be. And now also in 2024, the Defense Federal Acquisition Rule Supplement is about to be changed again, or it may already have changed earlier this week. I'm not quite sure whether it's published in the Federal Registry yet, but it's imminent. And now instead of just saying, hey, you have to meet NIST 800-171, you not only have to say that you meet it, you have to actually get a certificate by some authorized auditor company, and that is now called CMMC, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So that's going to be more impactful. Now you have to actually show that you are doing this. And also in 2024, over the summer, we had a dear colleague letter from NSF saying that NSF from now on will start treating proposals as controlled unclassified information, which means you have to manage it according to the standards laid out in NIST 800-171. Now, they didn't write this letter very carefully. They published it on Friday, and many people wrote them emails, including Carolyn and myself, speaking for the regulated research community of practice, like, hey, your memo is not clear on what it all implies, and there are lots of questions. And on Monday, after the weekend of receiving multiple emails, NSF relented and basically said, we will develop a frequently asked questions and we'll talk to you guys later. So the importance is that compliance is a shared responsibility. And a long time ago, compliance requirements were pretty simple. Now, when people are asking for a whole book of 110 controls, it is not something where the Office of Research in your institution can say, hey, we signed this contract, here's the money, and by the way, you have to take care of these controls. This is just too complicated to impose on the researchers and their students and postdocs. The institution has to make some kind of investment and effort to make sure that they take care of many of these compliance activities, and the researchers have to do their part. They have to go through training, they have to do their part, but they cannot be required to do all the continuous monitoring and documentation and all the information security activities. So that is something that we need to realize, and then CARC, as an organization of research computing facilitators, we need to help them make this work. But it's not something that we on our own are going to be able to do anyway either. So that then leads to, now that these requirements are out there, it is and it should be considered as a shared responsibility. So institutional leadership needs to be made aware, like, look, you can't just punt this off to the researchers because it's going to be a disaster. Actually, there are some examples of Penn State University and Georgia Tech where the administration sort of did that. They issued a policy and they said, okay, it'll be okay. And now they're in trouble. There are some lawsuits on False Claims Act, based on the False Claims Act, that are, causing trouble. So this is not something that you can just ignore. And in order to then provide a compliance framework, one of the things is you need to have infrastructure that meets those compliance requirements. And then there's sort of a second aspect with AI. gaining prominence since November of 22 when ChatGPT was announced. Everybody all of a sudden knows like, wow, AI is going to impact everything. It's also going to impact research. Furthermore, sometimes it requires really big resources. And that means that what in the past worked where a lab would say, I need some computation, and you get them a little computer. If you want to do AI, that little computer is not going to be enough. And you cannot buy a computer that's big enough to do the AI that you need every now and then to have a big enough computer in every lab, because nobody can afford that. So that again needs to be some institutional leadership and coalition to build a central infrastructure that everybody can use in an effective way so that you can, when the need arises, do some of these AI calculations. And so one important aspect of institutional compliance program is that it requires leadership to be fully engaged. And that means whatever your institution is, some board of trustees or board of governors, the president, the provost, the chancellor, whatever you call the top level people, the vice president for research, the chief information officer, the chief information security officer, all of these people have to be aligned and in agreement that, yes, we're going to do this. And everybody in the institution has to do their share. This is going to be very, very important. It cannot be just the primary or sole responsibility of the principal investigator and the researchers. And so the kind of compliance frameworks that there are is NIST. Federal government in the United States will base it on NIST, but they can be mapped to international standards organizations and other organizations like the HITRUST, which is a very standard framework that is used to meet protected health information, to meet the requirements of the the Health Insurance and Portability Act, HIPAA law, to meet that. And so then in order to get actually this final stage that people are now requiring in their contracts is you have to have some assessment, and you have to come up with these assessments are not cheap. They require effort, they require time. You have to hire somebody to do it. Sometimes you can do it internally, but internal is often doesn't carry enough weight. And with CMMC, you have to do an external assessor. And it's good to do an external assessor, because if you do it internally and you're not an experienced auditor, you interpret the language in the NIST documents incorrectly, and you think you meet them, and you actually don't. So that is where you have to have a compliance thing in place. And the typical assessment process has sort of 5 stages. And I'm giving you here the one that the HITRUST organization comes up with. You first start with some workshop to figure out what is the system you're going to assess and who needs to be involved in the process. Then you do some initial assessment where you sort of say, well, how close are you? Because if you're going to fail, then it's a big waste of effort. Then from that readiness assessment, you find out some of the failings that need to be fixed. That's done remediation. And then you actually do the full assessment and you get your certificate. And then there may be some follow-on assessment later on. And here I'm showing you the timeline. The University of Florida went through a HITRUST assessment in 22-23. And I can show you here the timeline. So it takes about a year to go through all these steps. And that is my sort of introduction on what is the current state of the art of the environment in research. And so talking to people, how will a small institution meet all these new requirements? They sort of come and it's like an unfunded mandate. So you have to come up with this stuff and manage these processes, provide documentation, provide training, do all the activities that are recorded and required in that compliance program. How do you do that? So one of the things that people have been talking about is we have an example. We could do something with regional collaborations, so that maybe a major university in a region does make some investment, and then smaller institutions use that resource while contributing. And we have a good example with regional networks that have sprouted since 2000, and they are now providing very good internet connectivity to multiple institutions in a cost-effective way. And this is something where maybe we could build on that sort of expertise and experience on how to get organizations on the same table to work something together so that it becomes more cost-effective. So that would be one approach to try and meet these compliance programs by building a regional resource center. And then I just want to finally call out the regulated research community of practice. It's now very effective in sharing information. The importance is that if you are a small institution or a big institution and you just start doing this, or you're the person hired at some institution to build a compliance program to meet these requirements, well, then you know that you're not alone. By reaching out to this organization, there's a lot of people who've been there, who are in the same boat you are, or who were in the same boat a year or 2 years ago, and they can give you all kinds of advice and information. We have a website that you can find all kinds of resources on. And there is a Slack channel that you can use this scan code and join the Slack channel and basically talk to your peers and get all kinds of advice. And that's basically now to get the conversation started. Here's some questions to ponder and maybe discuss in the coming minutes. How has your institution addressed compliance, and what challenges did you see arise? Who is leading the research cybersecurity efforts at your institution, and how did this help or impact supporting research? Who is asking about the implications of new compliance requirements, and how does that change the response? So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Erik. So before we jump into Q&As, we actually invited a couple of researchers who have actually implemented some of these controls for some specific use cases. So we have Jason Christopher from UC Berkeley and Ben Lynch from Minnesota. So either one of you want to start? Maybe Jason, you are unmuted, so you can give us your example of how you implemented. Yep.
Sure. I will share a screen. I just have one slide we can sort of look at as we go through here. So that was a great, Erik, that was a great sort of review of what I feel like is the landscape. I kind of broke this down into the trends, use cases, and Homefront. Maybe I'll focus mostly on some of the local use cases in Homefront. But basically, we at Research IT at UC Berkeley got into this space about 5 years ago when we looked around across campus and saw a lot of different departments needing some kind of level of secure research computing, whether it was working with moderately sensitive data or highly sensitive data. And so we've been invested in this for a while, and the landscape is really changing. We heard about how the compliance is tightening up. Berkeley's a distributed place, and so there are a lot of different groups with a lot of different incentives, and some of those crisscross each other and don't match up. So we struggle with that. That's become a much larger struggle for us. You have, on the one hand, groups like our sponsored projects and intellectual property offices pushing for research projects to be accepted and completed. And yet, and along with that, what we're seeing now is a real change in how we match up a project with the most appropriate compute platform. In the past, we would look at the data and we would do a sort of data classification and decide from that, is it moderately sensitive? Is it highly sensitive? Based on that conclusion, we would select the right compute environment. Now, groups, data providers are coming to us with lengthy documentation. I got one from California Department of Justice. It was multiple hundred pages asking me to indicate for each of the requirements described. Has it been planned? Is it unplanned? Is it implemented? Please describe. So this is like a huge lift to complete all of that. And we struggle with it. So it's becoming more and more of a challenge for us locally. Early on, we decided to make our highly sensitive environments for to meet the 800.171 standard. So we built an environment that provides HPC and virtual machines for that highly sensitive environment. We also worked for a more moderately sensitive environments, and they've been steadily adopted over time. And I'd say for our highly sensitive environment, probably our School of Public Health has been the biggest adopter. A lot of the folks in those places in public health have very highly sensitive data, and they don't have they unlike some of their research colleagues in other departments didn't have the long back history of research computing platforms available to them. So many of them have reached out and said, you know, this is what I need, and you're providing it. UC Berkeley provides a no-cost option to get into the environment, and that fulfills 90% of the needs of folks. If you need to scale up, you can do that too, and we use a condo model to do that. It's been super successful. I'm super excited about it still. Lawrence Berkeley Lab, who has controlled unclassified information, has recently partnered with us to use our secure environment called SRDC. So we are working with them as a partner. Of course, we have a long history with them. They also support a lot of our infrastructure and our HPC, but now they're also a customer of the environment. And we're also in the middle of setting up the same kind of relationship and MOU with UC Davis. So exciting, but real challenging to be in this place as everything tightens up. And I guess the last thing that I will mention as an illustration is the third item under use cases coming out of our environmental sciences group, who was working on a grant trying to get started with data from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And they insisted to us for many months that we must have an 853 environment. And we don't have an 853 environment. We have an 800.171 environment. And what was at stake here was 9 figures of grant funding. And so this went down to the wire until mysteriously to us, maybe not so mysteriously, but they finally were able to go with 800.171. But it was tense for a while. And I'm so happy that worked out, because it's a really cool project, and it obviously will be helpful for the researchers and bring a lot of investment and funding to the campus. But real challenges. I've talked too long. I'll hand off to the next person. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Ben, if you have slides, please go ahead. You can just talk.
Yeah,
either
here
way.
we go. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about one use case we have here at the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute. So I'm Ben Lynch. I'm the director of the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute. And I'm going to talk today just a little bit about one example, which is around our handling of dbGaP data from NIH. So I think it's important to give just a little bit of background on MSI for context, because managing compliance requirements depends heavily on the organization and the amount of staffing you have. So so we have 57 staff. A number of them are dedicated to partnerships with our departments. And several years ago, we were looking for a home for the dbGaP data, which had some additional compliance requirements that couldn't be met on our core HPC infrastructure. And so what we settled on was moving this into our local cloud infrastructure. So OpenStack was our preferred location because it was easier to isolate and control activity. Our core HPC systems have a lot going on, and it was challenging to make it both highly productive and meet the compliance requirements at the time. In particular, we had there were some compliance requirements for dbGaP data that required that we be able to delete every copy of it, and there wasn't any provision for copies that were in backups, and so we couldn't guarantee that it would easily be removed from every backup copy on a particular date. So we settled on using OpenStack, and so that we worked that out, and much like Erik mentioned earlier, this is a shared responsibility where we outlined the hardware aspects that we were handling, and had a set of training that researchers would go through to understand what their responsibilities were handling the data. And so a couple of years ago, there were some changes that NIH made that allowed us to move back onto the core HPC system. So that was actually really nice for a lot of our users. We had buttoned up some of the methods for single factor authentication into our systems. And then also they changed some of the language regarding backups. So that allowed all of our dbGaP data to start being analyzed on our core HPC system. So this was something really appreciated by our researchers. So there's a new curveball, and so this fall NIH announced that there's going to be some changes to their requirements for dbGaP data, and that it would need to follow some more restricted environment. And so after January 25th of this next year, new requests for dbGaP data will have to go on a more protected environment. And so, well, the short answer is that, on our systems after January 25th, we're not going to have it on our core HPC systems. So over the last 5 years, we've made numerous improvements, documenting a lot of what we do, getting third-party assessments, and developing a lot deeper relationships with our University Information Security, Health Information Privacy and Compliance Office, and the IRB. But despite all of the additional compliance controls that we have in place, it's still not going to be quite there in time. And so we have a lot more. We've taken a lot of steps to have a lot of our systems all meeting these additional compliance requirements, but we're really not going to hit the January timeframe. Fortunately, we do have another option, and so from the ground up, we have another system which we've named Blackwell. And so this is a system that was designed with data protected by HIPAA. And so this is enough of a resource that we'll be moving some of our dbGaP users over there. It's a bit of a downgrading experience, but this is our stopgap until we can continue to expand the additional core resources available to our genomics users. And I'll stop right there.
All right, thank you, Ben. So now let's open the floor for questions. If you have questions, feel free to unmute, type them in the chat. Let me quickly get started on the quick question here. So Ben presented this interesting case of dbGaP dataset. Now, NIH suddenly gave this notification in July and gave about 6 months time frame. That's generally not enough to get 800-171. So what can we do to inform NIH that they should be thinking about what the requirement, what it would imply that these requirements go in effect in 6 months? And can we go through the route of RR, like the regulated research community of practice, and ask that as a community represent a unified front to NIH, saying like, if you are going to put any additional restrictions, at least the lead time should be reasonable, or that's not something, or is that reasonable? I'm not 100% sure if 6 months is, at least for Penn State, it's not reasonable to have 6 months of lead time and bring up a new system which is 800-171 compliant.
Yeah, I guess for us, it's definitely going to be a downgrading experience, like I mentioned, for the researchers that are doing this, and it wouldn't even really be possible without some of the staff we have for data management and data stewardship. So I can imagine other organizations, it'll be even more painful for the researchers.
I think it is also important to not just focus on this dbGaP and then say, oh, we need to do something. This is the big emergency. And then a couple of weeks later, there is the CMMC DFARS thing. And a couple of months later, there is NSF with its, revised dear colleague letter. And they want to have, because more compliance is going to come. So if you build a system for meeting one need and try to meet their long list of controls, we need to get to something that is scalable, in the sense that we're going to build a system or build some process, and we'll have some certification that this meets your needs. And then anybody else who comes up with a list of 100 pages, we just tell them, look, we're not going to meet your 100 pages. We have this thing in place, and will that meet your need? Can we rewrite your contract so that that you find it acceptable that we meet these controls, which are, because if you have to look at all the detailed differences and then contractually meet them, it requires an enormous amount of time, and we don't have that much resources or time. So we need to come up with a more scalable solution rather than just solve the latest requirement from the latest agency.
That makes sense. So there were actually a couple of questions in the chat. One was asking, how expensive is Blackwell compared to core HPC? I guess that's for you, Ben.
Oh, yeah. So our Blackwell system, it's, I mean, it might be, on the order of, 20% more expensive. I think it's, but it's not really apples to apples, I guess, as far as the researcher is concerned, because we just don't have as many services deployed on it. There aren't as many tools available for the researchers to use. So that's really the main concern.
So it's really interesting hearing about a lot of the infrastructure and sort of systems you put in place, programs you put in place. But when, partly when you're talking about scaling, Erik, and I'm sure all of you face this, how do you deal with the training aspects around this? Because there's provisioning the system, and then there's teaching people how to use it so that they stay in compliance with all these requirements. And how have you addressed that challenge?
It requires extra staff, and they create videos that have to be updated regularly, and there has to be a policy. This is another important thing, a university-wide policy that says everybody at the university has to every year take cybersecurity training. And then in addition, when you are signed up for some project, like if you are a member of a DB Gap project, then you have to take this additional training. If you're part of a project that has an IRB with PHI, you have to take this additional training, and somebody has to develop that training. And then in addition to the training that you create maybe as videos, there has to be somebody who can answer questions when people have questions about these things. So you can't just say, oh, I'll make a video and now we're done. So it requires a dedication by the institution. You can't just do it, oh, we'll do this for this project. And I found somebody who can be paid 10% off my grant or 5% off my grant or something, and they will provide the necessary training for everybody involved in this grant. That's not a solution that'll survive.
I'll just add to that. I think that's an astute question, because it is part of the, I think it's part of the tightening up that we're experiencing. We have a program for use of our secure systems. Researchers must have an onboarding and agree to what we'll call a researcher use agreement that outlines their responsibilities for use of the system. And we actually revisit that whenever new folks are coming into the environment. What we don't do is we don't follow up on the requirements we have for their training. We tell the PI that this needs to happen, and it needs to happen in a regular way, and they sign off on that researcher agreement. But as yet, we haven't followed up on it, and we may. But we found that setting up regular check-ins with researchers, very lightweight, sometimes automated. It's just with a Google form that they're answering questions on, kind of keeps things fresh. And I suspect we'll develop along that kind of path to if we need to ramp up on some of the training side of it.
Yeah, I'm curious about that compliance bit. I mean, we often have to work with the security office to develop a lot of the systems. I'm curious when the compliance office is going to come around and say, well, how are you ensuring that people have done the training you're talking about, Erik, or people are actually following all these processes and practices and things like that?
Yeah, so we get documents that need to be signed, and then they get stored, and our auditors, they say, give me some examples of these documents, and show me the ticket where you actually talk to the person, or how you got that document recorded. Like, one of the things we do is we tell people they have to take this training, and then after the training, there's an online or in-person training, and that's when we give you the actual credentials to log into the system. And so they have to take the training, and it's at the end of the training that when we ask them, and then they sign the document, and then we give them access to the system. But again, we have to have records, and because that's what the auditors will ask for.
Yeah, that requirement for official records, has kind of moved us to start using ServiceNow for some of the workflow stuff. We just use it internally, but it's a way for us to kind of keep track of requests and fulfillments of configurations and setups for researchers. So we are lucky we have a person in our team who's very keen on ServiceNow and likes to dig into it. So she's been terrific in getting us moved in that direction.
Right, but that shows you that this is not something that happens on the side, right? There is a person, you have to find that person. And if you don't have any person like that in your organization, then you need to make the powers that be aware. It's like, we need to hire a person like that. And it could be a part-time person or whatever, but you cannot just say, oh, the faculty will do this on the side, or some other staff member, or some receptionist at the desk at the beginning of the building will keep record. No, that's not going to work.
Erik, there's a question. Do you have more than one system one more secure and others more relaxed?
Yes, we have our supercomputer is called Hypergator, and that one is high trust certified for PHI and FERPA data. And then there's a small piece of that, an enclave that has more tightened security that is ITAR and NIST 853 moderate and NIST 800-171 compliant.
Thank you, Erik. And so users that go through training will get access to this enclave, but otherwise, if they don't do training, they will get access to the...
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Erik, do you have an open HPC environment as well, or have you basically moved everybody into a secure environment?
Yeah, so what we did is, and this was an interesting project, we worked with the High Trust Alliance to get this, because we wanted to have our open environment sufficiently secure without impacting the usability to the open users, but still make it sufficiently secure that we could, with extra training and extra rules, have people deal with PHI on that same system. And so they have to also, so there are now 3 levels. You have the open computing, where people have to do the normal cybersecurity training and make sure you don't give your account away and all that kind of stuff. And then you have the people who want to deal with student data, FERPA or HIPAA data. They have to get IRB. They have to take extra training on FERPA or HIPAA, and their data is stored in special, more secure folders, and they have to follow extra rules. They have to sign an agreement. And then you have to have the next level where they get even more training to get into the secure enclave, and they have to get extra encryption keys and extra to get to that level. So yeah.
There's one more question in the chat. I'm curious if organizations challenged by these increasing and challenging compliance requirements and the need for more powerful hardware are considering cloud technologies.
Well, the interesting thing is, my recommendation is, if you're starting, using cloud for the hardware is very good, because hardware takes some significant cash investment, but it's not like if you go to the cloud now, it's cheap. If you look at the 110 controls in 171, there's maybe 40 of the 110 that are purely technical, and all the others are more complicated. They require staff, they require resources, they require commitments from the institution, and the cloud provider is not going to do that for you. So if you go to the cloud, you can replace your hardware and some of the security, and then you have to get a document from them, which they provide, that says we will meet those requirements. But in the end, you're still you're the one who has to set up the compliant program, and you have to be responsible for it. And it's your vice president for research who signs the contract that you will meet these requirements for this grant or whatever. So going to it's not like if you go to the cloud, now all of a sudden everything is covered by that cost. That's not true by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I asked just because when I saw that example of a 9-figure grant sort of at risk for being able to be worked on, and yes, you're right, it's a shared responsibility model in the cloud, but it's an option. And I know Cersei from Emory had commented on how they have found it a nice counterpart and a balance to their on-prem work as well. So I just put that out there to see if anyone else was thinking of it.
I mean, I know I've heard from others, especially where they don't have a big investment in on-prem, but that's the fastest path for them. And there's obviously use cases that are better suited to the cloud than they are to on-premise.
So this is where I feel that a regional development would be incredibly cost effective, because the business model of the commercial cloud providers is the wrong model to support higher ed. In higher ed, we have, if you have some peak use, like you need for 2 weeks, you need these fancy A100 GPUs, you know, and you have the expertise, you can just go into the cloud and you pay just for what you need, you're done. But if you want to support a program where all your thousands of students and all your hundreds of faculty can get all the work done they need to get done, then the bill is going to be very expensive. And that's what the regional network providers have shown. If we didn't have regional network providers that connected all our academic institutions to internet too, and to each other and to the world, and we would have to pay the Cox cables and the AT&Ts on a per packet basis, even with their so-called beneficial programs and great discounts, we would not be able to afford being connected. Right. So if you need a different business model, and it might be worthwhile to look at that and say, hey, there might be somebody, and we all get together and we hire the staff and we build the system, and it could still be yeah, and then but the financial model is different, you know. And I know, for instance, the Florida Lambda Rail, which is the regional network that manages the state of Florida, it was created in 2000 after the dot-com bubble. And it now is connecting all the state universities in the state, many community colleges, some high schools, and some libraries. It's all for research and education. We can't compete with AT&T. But the benefit is that for the last 24 years, all the institutions have been able to have a massive increase in bandwidth at almost a constant annual contribution, which is something that if we would have had to pay AT&T, would never have happened. We would not be able to afford the amount of traffic that we share today if we did not have our own regional network with its own business plan and its own strategic funding management and whatever.
It's great to hear a lot of spirited discussion about these things. It sounds like a couple of interesting potential topics for future discussion, but sadly, we are coming up against the top of the hour and we do have to wind it up. Amit, anything you want to add?
No, please. Yeah, go ahead, Sarki. Sarsi, I think you had one comment to add.
Yes, hi everyone. This is Sarsi Su with Emory University. We have a HPC cluster on AWS, but I want to emphasize that all the compliance and work, right, between the on-premises cluster and the cluster on AWS actually is quite similar. And you still have to do, you know, make sure your computer nodes are scanned and patched, make sure you have documentation for all your process, trainings for all your staff and the users, right? So I'll be happy to, you know, discuss that in the future in one of these calls with you all and how we did that. So.
Well, I assure you we will follow up with you, Sarsi. So thanks for joining today and contributing that. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Erik, Jason, and Ben for your presentations today, and everybody else for engaging in the discussion. This is a really interesting call.
Great.
Thank you all.
Have a great week, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.